All right. Good afternoon. Thank you for, I just want to first of all say thank you to everyone for coming here. Shows a commitment to learn with and from each other. I think that is the most important thing, is learning with and from each other, knowing that none of us has all the answers, knowing that we've all had different experiences, different backgrounds, coming into these types of things, coming into life in general. I want to thank the Waking Up White Collaborative for inviting me to speak on this topic. It's a topic that I have spoken on a number of times, and every time it's a little bit different, because every time I learn a little bit more, and every time I learn a little bit more about what I don't know yet, and so it just is constantly evolving. This was already covered, so I'm going to skip that. All right, before we even get started with anything else, not required, but I have a bunch of paper and some pencils back here, and if you have your own writing instruments, utensils, what I would love to do is I would love to take just about 60, 90 seconds. I would love to have you just free write to the following prompt, I am. So, narrative form, bullet point form, however you want to do it. If you just want to take a quick moment to just jot down whatever the first few things that come to your mind are when you hear the prompt, I am, talking about yourself. We'll come back to this in a little bit. So if you want to add to this as we go on, you're certainly welcome to. You'll see later on the point that I'm trying to make is I was trying to have you do this before you see anything that I have to say so that I don't influence what you write down. But if you want to add to it, you certainly can. It's yours, right? I do want to say that welcome to Hamilton Elementary. We're in our 4th year of being a community school. And we just finished up a fantastic building expansion project here. It's also the home of SOTA 1 Charter School of Technology and the Arts. And so 2 schools, 1 building, 2 schools, 1 community. And so I believe this, we have a partnership with the Boys and Girls Club where they are here every day for their after-school program, kindergarten through 3rd grade. But above and beyond that, I believe this is our first official community function in our new space. So welcome, congratulations, thanks for being part of that. Moment in time of our history. So, whenever I do a presentation, aside from moving around a lot, I like to put some learning objectives up there because I feel if we have a roadmap and an idea of where we're going, it's going to help us get there. And so these are the 3 learning objectives today. So the first is that I can describe the socialization of race. Second, I can explain how the socialization of race has shaped me and my identity. And the third, I can interpret how the socialization of race manifests in my interactions with others and name at least one thing I will do to counteract this. And so we're kind of taking it from a systemic, societal, or a systemic level to a personal level to a professional or a societal level as we interact with each other. So we're going to start up here. Before we dive into it, this these topics can be very, can provoke a lot of strong feelings in a lot of different directions. A lot of strong feelings in a lot of different directions. So, the first thing I want to do to get you to think about where you are personally with these types of conversations, these types of topics. Maybe one of these three represents where you are, where you're feeling. Discussing race and related topics makes me uncomfortable. I try to avoid such discussions as much as possible. I'm comfortable discussing race and related topics, but I'm also exhausted when it comes to such discussions. I'm comfortable discussing race and related topics, but I often leave such discussions overwhelmed and not knowing where to start. If you need to just stand up and stretch, you can do that. We have bathrooms down the hall to the left. If you need to just stand up and take a walk and process something, please feel free to do that. This door will open too without an alarm, so that is another option as well. Collective commitments. I'm just going to ask that we make some collective commitments to stay engaged, to speak our truth, to expect and accept non-closure. If you came here today hoping to solve all of the world's problems, or at least all of La Crosse's problems, you're probably going to be a little disappointed. Okay? Finally, a couple caveats. I much prefer, I know I'm the one standing up here holding the microphone, but I much prefer a conversation to a presentation. So at any time, if you've got a question or a yeah but or something that is just like not quite sitting right with you, please shout it out, raise your hand. I prefer a conversation to a presentation. And I definitely want to say that I am not the definitive source of all knowledge and information on this topic. I'm someone who has a passion about it, that has done a lot of research, and is trying to just spread the word and share what I know. And I'm still learning new things every day, okay? And one last thing on that topic is just to say that it is a privilege to be able to educate myself about race and about discrimination rather than to have to experience it myself. Because I cannot think of a single time in my life I've been discriminated against. And so I just feel the need to name that. All right, let's dive in. So I looked at the definition of socialization, and in the Oxford Dictionary it says, the process of learning to behave in a way that is acceptable to society. The process of learning to behave in a way that is acceptable to society. I want to make a quick differentiation between race and ethnicity. Race is a social construct created for the purposes of classifying human beings based upon physical or phenotypic characteristics, what you can see, such as skin color. Ethnicity is the social construct created for the purpose of classifying human beings based on shared ancestry, culture, and traditions. So a long time ago, as far back as we have written record of people, groups of people discriminating against other groups of people. A long time ago in ancient Greece, discrimination was based upon where you came from, which made sense, like this village is fighting with that village, this village wins, we're going to discriminate, you're coming from somewhere different, you're not part of us, right? Even further away than just the next village over, more examples of that. But these differences were thought to be due to geographical and climate differences. And simply like, those are the people that live over there, right? It's like Logan and Central a little bit, right? Okay? And this inferior status was not fixed, okay? It could simply be solved if one adopted Greek culture. So it's not, you are inferior to me forever because of who you are, it's because you're not part of my group. But if you come and join my group, then we're all good, okay? It's almost like a new student out of high school, right? Think about what they experience until they find an in crowd. Similar things have been found for ancient Rome, and the Han Dynasty, and ancient China, etc., etc. Fast forward to the 14th century, there was some myths out there that darker skin was a sign that someone had been cursed. But there was no evidence for that, no basis for that. And the Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun wrote that black skin was due to the hot sub-Saharan climate. Similar things going on here. Consistently over the course of history, we notice differences, but they are consistently attributed to climate and where people live and the differences in climate there. In the late 18th century, there was a big shift. A man called Johann Blumenbach, in 1775, he published his dissertation, which turned into a book later on. He was fascinated by the idea, as many before him were, about classifying human beings. And he proposed classifying them into different subspecies, okay? And even though he kind of said the same thing, that the differences are largely attributed to climate, his classifications, and specifically saying that they're subspecies, had a profound impact that still lasts today. Just a quick word specifically, this is where we first see the term Caucasian. Okay, he did a lot of traveling in his time, and he went to a place, it's a mountain region known as the Caucasus, in between Europe and Asia. And what he found, he came back and he wrote that these are the most beautiful people in the whole world that he had ever seen, is the people from the Caucasus region, which is where we get the term Caucasian. And it's an interesting note, and we'll dive into a little deeper later when we talk about identity development, but even the simple fact of Caucasian as opposed to Asian American, African American, Hispanic American, like that hyphenation implies and leads to a little bit of a broken identity. So if you look at the year here, 1775, some pretty big events were going on here in our own country around that same time that he was putting this classification out about the subspecies, right? And so his work, Johann Blumenbach's work, had a profound impact on our founding fathers in this country and what they did. And there was a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of contradictions. So Thomas Jefferson wrote right around, a year later, when he's writing the Declaration of Independence, writes that all men are created equal. Yet, 20 years later, in his famous Notes on the State of Virginia, he writes that he suspected that black people were inferior to white people. So that's quite a contradiction. He introduced legislative measures against slavery, yet owned over 600 slaves in his lifetime. That's quite a contradiction. There's a saying that I have to live by that says, when the principal sneezes, the school catches a cold. And it's very true. We see it in our children as well. Our younger children look up to their older children. That's where they get their information from. That's where they learn how to behave. That's where they learn on what is socially acceptable and what's socially not. And so if this is socially acceptable from those in charge, that's going to be a problem. Now, something that's interesting is a little bit about the story of immigration in this country. So our first big wave of immigration, 1815 to 1865, mostly Irish, Italian, and German immigrants. And all of them were discriminated against. They were coming in, they were different, we didn't like them. All of them were dehumanized in some way, shape, or form. A lot of times based upon religious affiliation. Gaining acceptance for these groups of people often required immigrants to ostracize members of the next wave of immigrants. Being white, becoming white themselves by opposing those who weren't, or who weren't yet deemed white, right? There's a book here, Working Towards Whiteness. There are a ton of great resources out there if you're interested to dive more. I mean, I'm barely scratching the surface on immigration and all that entails. There's a ton of great resources out there, though, about how the concept of white came to be and what does that really mean, what does that really entail. The term melting pot, I'm sure we've all heard this in relation to the United States. The United States is a great melting pot, right? First used the term in 1908. And everyone's one big happy family. Whiteness was used to consolidate power around skin color at the expense of everyone else's cultural heritage. right? And so that's where that definition beginning, separating race and ethnicity, is an important one. So I want to make an analogy. Chicken wild rice soup. Fantastic. But would we just, sometimes we simply call it soup, but yet we have carrots, and we have rice, and we have chicken, and we have celery, and we have broth, and like there are so many different parts, right? Same thing, similar with a salad, right? You wouldn't call a salad just lettuce, it's a salad. And all of the pieces in there, this is a quote, sorry, from Jane Elliott, we don't need a melting pot, we need a salad bowl. In a salad bowl, you put in the different things. You want the vegetables, the lettuce, the cucumbers, the onions, the green peppers. You want those things to maintain their identity. You appreciate differences. So when I hear melting pot, I think we're devaluing differences. We are devaluing diversity in the name of consolidating power. The socialization of race shows up in any number of ways today. Television, movies, advertising, textbooks, political speeches, laws and regulations, unwritten rules, redlining, cultural stereotypes in the news. The impacts and the effects of the messages that are sent to us over the last hundreds of years are cumulative. I'm going to share a few examples. Here is a really old advertisement. Here's a much more recent advertisement. Again, long time ago, not so long ago. Obviously, I pulled this off of Twitter, and this person here, see no difference. This was probably about 5-6 years ago. There was a huge uproar about this one because it says "coolest monkey in the jungle" on the sweatshirt. See the resemblance? It's not just the black-white dichotomy, right? We see racist Native American imagery, indigenous peoples imagery all over. It's everywhere. How about this one? Anybody see what's going on here? Yeah. Where's Dad? When I saw this image, I'm going to pause for a moment. When I saw this image, it made me really think and reflect on a lot of things. Because I don't know if you've ever seen, well, I'll tell you that in just a moment, but it made me wonder. And I started to do some research, and I'm certainly not the definitive source of knowledge on this topic or this nugget of information as well, but I started to research. I'm wondering how many African cultures value single parenthood as one of their core values in their cultures. And I started to do some research, and I found 0. And if you've seen documentaries like 13th or other things of that nature, this was a conscious decision, right? That started with breaking up families that came over in the African slave trade, and then continued all the way up to some of the most recent examples are like mandatory minimum sentencing, and how a lot of these policing practices and criminal justice practices are very discriminatory and have a very disparate impact, specifically targeting black men more than white men, right? I believe that 1 in 9 white men will end up in prison at some point in time in their life. For black men, it's 1 in 3. 3 times as much. But if you really dive into it, like it's not an accident, and it's not a cultural value either. It was a very intentional effort through a lot of different practices, all the way dating back to when the Atlantic slave trade first started. But yeah, it's subtle. It's subtle. You don't necessarily see it at first. How about this one here? The American Red Cross, right? how to behave at a pool. She's okay. They're okay. Who's not cool? Who's being naughty, right? Her down here, up there, there. Not sure about him. How about some of the cultural stereotypes that we have, right? If I am getting married and I want to represent purity and things that are good, what color dress do I wear? White. If I am looking to engage the more carnal side of my being, which is a common stereotype that's been used, especially for black people, for a long time, what do I wear, right? How about devil's food cake, angel's food cake? Does anybody play chess here? What do the official rules of chess say? Who always goes first in chess? Always. It's in the official rules. You don't even get to decide. Exactly. White goes first, right? How about pool? The black ball, the 8-ball, you don't even want to touch it, right? Now, I've had people, some friends might share with me, who are black, that they say, well, you could also look at it as it's the most powerful one. Absolutely. You certainly could. Right? One thing that I'm going to share, well, I'll share right now, there's a quote out there that says, there are no accidents, only precedents. When it comes to this type of thing, socialization, there's no accidents, only precedents, right? Any one of these things taken in isolation could be a mere coincidence, could be unintentional. All of this, taken in collective though, has a very subliminal influence on us. How about the stories that we're told? Anybody have a guess? How old, this is the statue of Rosa Parks. How old does she look there?
50s,
60s. 60s. Other guesses? So the story that we're frequently told about Rosa Parks is we have a frail old lady who was too tired from a long day's work, didn't want to give up her seat. And in the end, you know what? Actually, we all learned something. It led to more equal rights for all. That's the story that we are frequently told. She was 42 years old. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. When they were planning this was a planned event. They were thinking about who to choose. They specifically chose her because she had the legal background and she had the public speaking background that they felt she would be successful in court. That's a big difference between those two stories, right? This one, it's a kumbaya moment of enlightenment for us all where we can make small advancements forward, but not really. This one threatens the status quo. How about Jackie Robinson, the first African American to play in the major leagues, leading to the integration of baseball? He's a tremendously talented athlete. He's a hero, he's brave. He is a hero, he is brave. I'm not discounting that, right? That's what we're frequently told. What if we reframe the story? Jackie Robinson, the first African American white baseball owners allowed to play. And why did they allow him to play? Money. They realized he's going to bring in more tickets. He was a great baseball player, don't get me wrong. But framing the narrative a little bit differently, you know, I don't have a slide in here, but speaking of just subtle yet profound differences, I did not learn in my whole time in elementary school, middle school, high school, college, undergrad, and first time through grad school, I had no idea what Juneteenth was. I had no idea. I knew what the 4th of July was. I had no idea what Juneteenth was, right? And so in the last, 5, 6 years, one thing that I frequently reflect on is I think about the similarities and differences between the two. And July 4th Independence Day, it was proclaimed by whom? White men, right? Juneteenth, freedom was given by whom? Given by white men. Even that subtle distinction just gets me. And like, there aren't enough people talking about that. And there's a lot to unpack there, and that's not exactly, on the script here, but for what it's worth. Okay. I'm gonna grab a drink here, 1 second. All right. A couple of other concepts that I want to share with you. The one-drop rule. I don't know if you're familiar with the one-drop rule, but it really started picking up in the Reconstruction era, right after the Civil War. And the one-drop rule basically says, if you have even one drop of black blood in your ancestry, you are black. And this was actually written into many state statutes by the year 1900 in terms of classifying people based upon race. If you have one drop, you're considered black. But the idea of blood quantum, which dates back to the early 18th century, the idea of blood quantum is specific to Native Americans, indigenous people, specifically saying that you have to have a certain percentage to be considered a member of that tribe, or racially to be able to check that box that says, I'm Native American, I'm an indigenous person, right? This was widely used and applied and pushed out there by the United States government after the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. So essentially, our indigenous brothers and sisters are the only ones who have to register with the federal government and prove who they are. In fact, many tribes still use blood quantums today, anything from 1/4 to 1/16 to 1/32 in order for membership, right? And the federal government, of course, used it for different types of benefits that they would pay out because of what happened, and that's a whole other conversation as well. Some tribes use lineage as well, and some use a combination. But I want us to pause and just consider this for a moment. That says, okay, for you, if you have even one drop, you're excluded. You're not part of whiteness, right? But for you, you have to prove that you have a certain amount in order to prove your race, your ethnicity, who you are. And it's like, who is defining race? And they're clearly doing it in different ways when it's convenient for different purposes. So, there's that. Jane Elliott. Anybody know who Jane Elliott is? Remember her? The blue eyes, brown eyes? Back in Iowa?
Yeah, yeah.
A long time ago, 1968.
Long time ago.
For those of you that don't know, she was a third grade teacher, and I think she had the idea, but she was really spurred to action. So she did this experiment in her classroom for the first time the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And I think that had such a profound effect, and she was talking about it with her students, and they just weren't getting it. They just weren't understanding why. And so then she told them, she decided to just launch into this, fantastic social experiment. She told them that actually, those of you with brown eyes are superior to those of you with blue eyes. And they all started looking around, checking each other's eyes and whatnot. And she went on and on to explain how brown-eyed people are smarter, and they do better on tests, and they're more athletic. And she had all of the blue-eyed people, I believe, put something like a pin on their shirt or something to designate it. And then she watched what happened. And over the next couple of days, the children with brown eyes began to treat the children with blue eyes very poorly. Even kids who were best of friends before started treating each other very poorly, very much treating them like inferiors. The children with brown eyes started to do better on their tests, started to score better, And then she came in after about 3 days, and she said, oh, I made a mistake. I mixed it up. It's actually the other way around. It's actually blue-eyed people that are better than brown-eyed people. It's actually blue-eyed people that are smarter, faster, stronger. And then she let that narrative go for a couple of more days. And some similar things happened, but the children with blue eyes were not as mean to the children with brown eyes because they had experienced it themselves. And so certainly some had, but it wasn't like it was the first few times here. And so this is quite possibly one of the most powerful social experiments ever conducted. And it really gets to my point of the socialization in the sense that if she can get a group of children to turn on each other and act like that and perform better just simply by telling them that your eye color determines everything, like that is some amazing proof of the process of socialization, whether it's around race or eye color or height or whatever the case may be. More recently, the Human Genome Project, they sequenced the first full human genome, I believe in 2003, and they found that 99.9% of genetic material is shared across races, which after you process that for a little bit, you might say, okay, but that kind of leaves the door open, because what about that other 0.1%? Like, could that be the difference between races? Like, maybe there is a scientific component. And what they found is that 0.1% of genetic material is what makes up our physical appearance. And what they found is, as they traced across generations, then in further research, and they studied the genes that make up that 0.1%, they found that the differences that evolved in those phenotypic characteristics are, one, due to climate and geography, and two, they evolved separately from anything else. They evolved separately from height, they evolved separately from susceptibility to cancer, they evolved separately from intelligence and any other attribute. But the most important thing that the Human Genome Project found is that the variation within any one specific race was much wider than the variation across races. So I go back to this, there are no accidents, only precedents idea. And this cartoon here, what is this cartoon depicting? Anybody want to take a guess?
She looks angry.
This is depicting Irish immigrants.
Right.
This is a cartoon depicting Irish immigrants.
Really?
There are no accidents, only precedents. It goes back to that idea that if you are not on the inside, if you're on the outside, we're pushing you out, keeping you out, until we need to bring you in to keep a certain amount of power consolidated here in what is whiteness. There's cartoons like these for all those other groups of immigrants that I listed, same thing, same thing. All right, so it's just this vicious cycle. Author and advocate Ta-Nehisi Coates says, race is the child of racism. Race is the child of racism. Okay? Do you remember when Johann Blumenbach had his big thesis, the Caucasian and the different subspecies? What year was that? 1775. Right? That's when we first see the word race really used in popular literature, scholarly works, at least according to what we have available to us today. Does anybody know what year the Atlantic slave trade started? You're close. 1526. We were doing this for 250 years before we conveniently had a reason to be doing it. So you can see why he says race is the child of racism. Put another way, here's a quote from just a couple years ago, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. They say, race does not provide an accurate representation of human biological variation. It was never accurate in the past, and it remains inaccurate when referencing contemporary human populations. Humans are not divided biologically into distinct continental types or racial genetic clusters. Instead, the Western concept of race must be understood as a classification system that emerged from and in support of European colonialism, oppression, and discrimination. So if you're a numbers person like me, but for the English majors out there, that was a joke. Okay. White fragility, also known as white defensiveness, white denial. You've probably heard one of these topics. I know that you've got some other speakers later on coming in, so I'm not going to dive too deep into it. But I do want to touch on it because it is definitely a part of the socialization of race and a part of the socialization of how we talk about or don't talk about race, okay? These are some of the current contemporary scholars that are doing a lot of great work diving into these topics, building off of historical scholars such as Bell Hooks and W.B. Du Bois. This is from, actually, so Robin DiAngelo's book, White, with the same name, White Fragility, is probably the most popular book out there, most well-known, came out just a few years ago. She defines white fragility as the emotions and the reactions that come up when there's any sort of racial stress. Now, racial stress could be having this conversation, racial stress, excuse me, I blame the mask. Racial stress could be simply being in the same room as somebody who is of a different race. Or elevator, absolutely. So, these feelings, singled out, attacked, silenced, shamed, angry, scared, outraged. Sometimes crying, physically leaving, emotionally withdrawing. Claims that people make. Well, I know people of color. Well, you don't know me. You're generalizing. That is just your opinion. Okay? Assumptions that people make. And the function, the reason for all of these. And I want to say that there's a lot of criticisms of her work out there. And I'll share a few of those with you in a moment. And the way that you feel is absolutely okay. Everybody can feel the way that they feel, okay? My point in bringing this up is to try to help you see how, through all of that messaging, in the advertising, in the stories that were told, so on and so forth, through all of that messaging, another thing that has become socialized is that we avoid conversations about race. Now, not you all, because you're obviously here, but we live in a community right now of about 100,000 people, if you include all the suburbs of La Crosse. And this is a pretty small percentage out of 100,000. I know we're competing with the Badger game, but there's probably a lot of other people that could have been here that aren't. So the key takeaway that I want you to get goes back to one of our collective commitments, and that we collectively agree in these conversations to experience discomfort, right? Within discomfort is growth. If I go to the gym to get stronger, and I'm just doing 5-pound barbells, I'm not getting any stronger. I'm sure I'm comfortable. I could do that all day, but I'm not growing, right? Anyway, so in the book, DiAngelo talks about this good-bad binary. And again, I don't want to go into too much depth because I know that there's another presentation later on specifically on this topic. But essentially, this says that we have been conditioned to think the following way. We've been conditioned to think that racist equals bad and not racist equals good, okay? So within this paradigm, To suggest that I am racist is to deliver a deep moral blow, a kind of character assassination. Having received this blow, I must defend my character, and that is where all my energy will go. To deflecting the charge rather than reflecting on my own behavior. Put another way, we have been conditioned to believe, to think that racism is a conscious, intentional act or an intentional belief, specifically to harm or discriminate. Rather, I would suggest, and this book would suggest, that racism, it's a lot more subtle. It's a lot more systemic. It's a lot more subconscious. But if we are stuck in this binary way of thinking, rather than like a continuum, if we're stuck in this binary way of thinking, and I'm not out there, calling people names, and I'm not out there, actively promoting discriminatory practices. I'm not doing those, so I can't be this, so I must be this. And so now you're going to tell me that actually I have implicit bias? Well, no, because I'm not doing these things, right? You see how we've been conditioned to think that, when we get stuck thinking about it here and here, we're just totally shut off to any possibility that we have an opportunity to grow. I'm going to skip some of that because I'm sure it's going to be covered deeper in the other presentation. So some criticism specifically of Robert DiAngelo's work, like I said before, it's a privilege to learn about racism and discrimination rather than experience it. Some people say there's not enough focus on the influence of the socialization of race in her book. Lucky for you all, you got to hear the last 40 minutes of what I said, right? Some people say it's not solution focused enough. It still centers whiteness as the norm. So there's some drawbacks. There's some drawbacks, just like with anything out there, right? And like I said before, I don't want you to walk away thinking that I am the definitive source of knowledge on this topic or any topic. I am still learning myself each and every day. But some suggestions that she does offer in the book, and that other people have echoed similarly, I would just say, to interrupt white fragility, we need to build our capacity to sustain the discomfort of not knowing, the discomfort of being racially unmoored, and the discomfort of racial humility. And while we worry that if we have revealed our racism in any way, the people of color in our lives will give up on us, I have found the opposite to be true. When we engage with the feedback and seek to repair the breach, the relationship deepens. Trying to explain away our racism does not fool people of color or bring them closer. So that kind of covers our first objective here, and you've probably seen some of those things or heard some of those things before, but hopefully you saw at least one thing today that was new that you didn't see before that can just kind of add to your knowledge base to be able to describe this to somebody. If somebody says, well, what does that mean? Hopefully you have a little bit better knowledge about that. So going into our second topic here, I can explain how the socialization of race has shaped me and my identity. So I want you to think for a second back to what you wrote down before, when you responded to the prompt, I am. Okay? And if you want to chat with your neighbor about it a little bit for a moment, you can. I'm going to get a drink here. But if you just want to reflect yourself, I want you to reflect on these two questions. How did you describe yourself? And how did you end up defining yourself? And if that's confusing, the difference between the two, it's okay, it's meant to be. I'll explain it in a moment.
What'd you write down? Because I thought those were like my first two conversations right now, so I just want to feel like we're gonna take up
cover them and it's how powerful they know that. Sociology. I do it sociology, but I
I'm going to pull us back together in about 30 seconds. About 30 seconds. If I could pull you back for just a moment. Yeah, I know. No, great conversations. I want you to continue the conversations in just one moment, but I have something else I want to share with you real quick. So this is something that I created here. This idea. I mean, somebody else may have done it too, but it just was an idea that came to me a few months ago. Thinking about identity development, I kind of felt like there was some distinct categories that kind of were surfacing for me. We had this idea of preferences, values, personality traits, right? You know, I am a Packers fan, right? I am I am kind, right? I am energetic, right? There's a lot of different ways that we can describe ourselves that would fit into this category. Second category is how we relate to others. I am a father. I am a husband. I am a son. Right? I am a mother. I am a daughter. I am an aunt. I am a friend. And then how we relate to societal constructs. I am white. I am male. I am cisgender. So on and so forth. Right? And so I started, the more I was really thinking about this, I thought, like, these can change pretty easily. Right? I mean, as soon as Rogers is gone, I don't know. Just hopefully not. How we relate to others. Like, this can change, but usually at quite a cost. How we relate to societal constructs, usually can't change those. Power dynamics, basically non-existent. You like the Vikings, Bears? What?
A Cubs fan.
Cubs.
Sorry,
Okay.
an Illinois person.
Yeah. There can be some power dynamics in how we relate to others. I am a boss. There's some power dynamics there. It's how we relate to others, right?
Right.
huge power and privilege dynamics in play when we talk about these categories of identity, right? You can see some examples over here. I want you to think for a moment about how you described yourself, right? How many of the things that you wrote down were in this category? How many were here? How many were here? I want you to think about how you define yourself. Because the difference between describe and define, when I describe, I'm simply giving information about. When I define, I'm adding value to. I'm placing value upon. I value being a father, being a husband. I value being kind, right? Society values me being male. Society values me being white. So when you answered that prompt, I am, where did you first go to? I would love to do like a, double blind, fully, APA style study sometime to find out if there's differences among people in what they tend to put down across these categories. Because I have a theory, and that theory is the more that I fall into these categories defined by society that grant me certain rights, power, and privilege, the more I'm going to be up here. Because it's not pushed in my face each and every day. And so I don't necessarily have to think about it. So, with this in mind, I want to give you a few minutes to circle back to those conversations that you were having, to kind of revisit how did you describe yourself and how do you define yourself? When you think about you as an individual, as a human being, and the value that you have, the value that we all have, what's coming up for you? How are you defining yourself? So go ahead. I'm going to take about 3 to 5 minutes to let you dive back into those conversations, because as enthralling as it is to hear my voice, when you get to talk, the more people you get to talk with, the more that's when we're learning with and from each other. So go ahead and get back into those conversations.
What did you put down? What I say? I wrote that I think that my husband and son and almost embarrassed by the fact that I'm what's that? No? What did you write? First of all, are they male or female? Not based on law, but based on practice.
About 1 minute. All right. If you could just take a moment to wrap up the conversations. It's always hard to cut off great conversations. I want to show you, so the topic of identity development is in a lot of places, it's an entire course. It's an entire lifetime, really, of learning and unpacking and unlearning and relearning. But I want to show you one other thing real quick that that I did. I took several dimensions. Actually, first of all, I want to share something. I'm constantly reordering the script in my mind, if you couldn't tell, by the way, right? When we are born, what happens? Actually, if you, depending upon what you want to find out, you can find it out even before you're born, right? Someday, even before you're born, we are assigned what? Assigned gender. What else are we assigned? Race. Before my parents even give me my name to help me form my identity, before I even have my name, society has already put me in a couple of boxes. So like I said, it's a whole nother rabbit hole that we just don't have time today to go down in terms of power and privilege within society, and specifically the ways that society puts us into boxes with identities. But taking some of those that there are typically huge power and privilege dynamics in play, and putting them on this sort of a spiderweb type map, and then putting, this is based upon, I forgot to put the citation, so I apologize, based upon some work there, but for example, so the further out, the more inherent power and privilege is granted to you based upon that identity by society. And so I've just recently been kind of tinkering around with this to see what it looks like. But I did a couple, for example here. This on the left is me. And this on the right is a student that I am struggling to connect with. A student that is really struggling at school. And I made a few guesses for them on some of these things. Probably wouldn't be appropriate for the principal to be asking a 6-year-old certain questions about some of these things. So I made a few assumptions. But, and like I said, I've just been tinkering around with this, so I'm not exactly sure where to go with it yet. But it just provides quite a visual, quite a stark contrast between myself and this individual, this student in particular. Yes, sir.
Have you ever thought about doing it from student to student?
I have not.
In regards to the demographics of, there's a variety of demographics and just in this community.
Mm-hmm.
So have you ever thought about utilizing that?
I have not, but I'm processing in real time, and I could see a very powerful conversation being facilitated with some of our students if they did some of this identity mapping for themselves. Maybe not our 5 and 6-year-olds, but maybe some of our 4th, 5th, middle school, high school. That's a great idea. Yeah, thank you for that. Yes?
Dr. Burns, what about ACE, adverse childhood experiences? How does that fit in? Because on the left, here you are an adult,
Yes.
and you have admitted to us that you had quite a privilege
Yes.
childhood. I don't know about your childhood, but you kind of said, well, I just haven't had any stumbling blocks.
Right.
So now we've got this 5-year-old, 6-year-old. And what are the adverse experiences this kiddo is experiencing in his real time?
Absolutely. So,
That might be a rabbit hole.
well, it's it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I'll go down it for a moment. What she's talking about is, let's see, I just made an assumption right there. I don't know what your personal pronouns are, but adverse childhood experiences. You've probably heard of those, and I wish I had the graphic up here. I could probably find it, but it might take me a few minutes. So if you're curious to learn more about that, I can find it after we're done. But there's a graphic that I came across about 4 years ago that just imagine with me for a moment. There's a big tree here, okay? There's a line in the middle that represents the ground, and so you got the roots underground and you got the branches up top, okay? And the branches up top are the ACEs that we've heard a lot about in the last 5-10 years, the adverse childhood experiences. So such as drugs in the home, or a parent who's incarcerated, or experiencing any kind of abuse as a child. These are these adverse childhood experiences that have a profound impact on our lives and have a profound impact on how we show up every day and the things that we carry with us, right, for our children. And a lot of those are, so these are, specifically these are experiences, and they're not necessarily identities in ways that people would define or describe themselves, but they, I think the best way to say this, like, a lot of the systemic oppression and discrimination in society based upon identity leads to a very disparate impact in terms of who experiences ACEs and who doesn't. Is that maybe a way to say it? But what I love about this graphic is, because it ties it all together, down here where you have the roots, is a different type of ACEs, and I don't know if anyone has seen this graphic, but it's adverse community environments. And so these are things like discrimination in housing practices and the redlining and discrimination in policing practices where they police one neighborhood over the other, or even mandatory minimum sentencing. And so all of those things lead to these adverse community environments. These are the roots of the tree, and then they produce the experiences. And the whole point is that, like, if we just see what's above ground, if we just see those experiences, we are fighting an uphill battle. So, I'm a little further down the rabbit hole here, but here at Hamilton, we're in our 4th year of being a community school. And so we have really embraced this. And so what we try to do as a community school is all schools are set up to meet individual needs reactively. A child is hungry, we get them some food. They don't have a winter coat, we get them a winter coat. There is nothing wrong with that, right? All schools are set up to do that, to have some resources for that. That's not a problem at all. But we see the bigger picture. And we have extra resources. We have a full-time person, her office is right there, as a community school coordinator. We have extra resources, we have a ton of partnerships, like for example, the Boys and Girls Club, where we are not only trying to meet individual needs reactively, we are trying to identify and meet systemic needs proactively. One thing that we are working on this year is something that we're calling Healthy Families, Healthy Communities, in which we have engaged about 30 different community partners in the La Crosse area. They're all partners with a lot of great services and supports for families out there, but for whatever reason, there are barriers to those supports being accessed. And so we are going to start a cohort model with our families here, not just at our building, in our neighborhood, really open to anybody in the community, but where we're going to identify what are those barriers to accessing the services, because the services exist, but they're not being accessed. So I'll give you one example. A lot of parents that we surveyed said they were interested in furthering their own education. And so we were trying to figure out what the barrier was, and for a lot of them, it wasn't money. Like, there's scholarships, there's grants out there. It wasn't necessarily childcare. For a lot of our parents, they didn't feel comfortable on campus. That's what they told us. They said, I am a 27-year-old single mother. These are 18-year-old college kids. Like, I feel out of place. Like, I feel awkward. Like, I don't know where to begin. And so we're talking with Western right now about, now that we have this space that we can do it, we're talking about a cohort model here to get a couple of classes going, get them under your belt, get started, and then being able to access. I mean, we certainly can't replicate everything that Western has over there. I don't know if you've been in their buildings, but they're amazing buildings. We certainly can't replicate everything, but can we identify some barriers? Can we engage our community partners to think outside the box, to be able to kind of tear down those barriers? So, quite a rabbit hole, but one that's obviously very near and dear to my heart and near and dear to my job each and every day. And so the more that we can identify and address those root causes, the less we'll see of those actual experiences. But they are very much tied into the identities and the discrimination and systemic oppression that are seen based upon those. All right, moving into the last section of the day here. I can interpret how the socialization of race manifests in my interactions with others and name at least one thing I'll do to counteract this. Oh, somebody did? Okay. I want to circle back to this definition again real quick though. And you can't quite see it, I guess, but I italicized a couple of words here. The process, meaning repetitive, intentional over time, the process of learning to behave, including thoughts and feelings, not just actions, behave in a way that is acceptable to society. So when you think about the term socialization, hopefully you can see what I mean by that. So what do we do about it? Well, I would argue we need a process of learning to see how society has influenced us to think and behave in a certain way. That would be a great place to start. there's a video, we don't have time for the video, and it looks like it's not gonna work anyways with our Wi-Fi browser settings here at school. But I want you to do this. If you've got a writing instrument with you, I want you to pick it up and hold it. I want you to hold it in your right hand, okay? And you may have done this before. If you've seen this before, play along. Hold it in your right hand like you're gonna write with it, and look and read it. Okay? Now switch it to your left hand. Hold it like you're going to write with it and look to read it. It should be upside down. It's a small thing, it's a subtle thing, but it reinforces it's a right-handed world. Right? So when we talk about racist, not racist, and anti-racist, I want to first apply that logic to some other situations. So handedness. Just imagine if we had, I have 4 sons, and 2 of them are left-handed. And we were all playing baseball this summer. So just imagine if there were only right-handed baseball gloves, okay? If there were only right-handed baseball gloves, racist, so exclusion, think about it in terms of let me back up. Think about racist in terms of exclusion. Non-racist is passive inclusion, and anti-racist is active inclusion. Sorry, I should have that up there for visual, but bear with me for a moment as I share some examples. So, baseball, right-handed baseball gloves, couple of kids, left-handed, they want to play too, right? Would we say, no, you can't play? Would we say, well, sure you can play, but the glove's going to feel a little weird because we only have right-handed gloves? Or do we say, yeah, you can play. You know what? We'll make a glove for you. We'll make a glove for you so that it's fair. How about this? Let's say we have a student in a wheelchair, and we've got a classroom that's on the 2nd floor, and that's their classroom. Do we say, nope, you got a wheelchair? No, you can't come here. Do we say, well, you're welcome to park outside the window and kind of get what you can get here and from the 2nd floor? Like, we're not kicking you out, but, or do we say, you know what, we got an elevator right over here? Because that's what's right. Right? And you can see how we might apply that same thing. Now, please understand, when we make a left-handed glove, we don't say to that left-handed person, we don't say, okay, now I'm going to come in and I'm going to toss it underhand, right? Just to make it nice and easy, and you know what, I caught it, but you know what, why didn't you run the bases anyway? No, like it's fair, it's even, right? Given the same playing field, right? Same thing with ability. We don't say, oh, come on in, right? And you sit over here and we'll just make it really easy for you. Don't worry, you don't have to do the test, right? 2001? The No Child Left Behind Act, which started this era of standardized testing and high-stakes standardized testing in public education in this country. I haven't met a teacher yet that likes it, but that's besides the point. My point is, George W. Bush, in signing that into law, what he said he was trying to do with that, or what they said they were trying to do with that, was he talked about the soft racism of low expectations. Okay? If you dive into a lot of advocates, whether it is around race, or gender identity, or sexual orientation, or whatever it is, when you dive into what they're looking for, the change they're trying to make, they're not saying, yeah, every time I hit the ball, I want it to be a home run. They're saying, like, get me a left-handed glove. Right? Okay. There we go. So this idea of racist, non-racist, anti-racist, we don't really have time to dive into it, but something, food for thought, is if there was a continuum, where would you place non-racism? Closer to racism? Closer to anti-racism?
racism.
It's food for thought, right? This right here, this idea of anti-racism, that is a whole nother talk in and of itself. But I want to give you a couple of concrete examples from just the last couple of years of my experience here, just a couple of concrete examples to give you an idea of what I mean. So my school here, 60% of our students identify as students of color. We're the only school in the district with over 50%. About 83% of our students come from low-income backgrounds, and a high incidence rate of childhood trauma of those ACEs, high incidence rate. And a couple of years back, I took all of the students on a field trip over to the Viterbo Fine Arts Center here, and they had a play. And in the play, this was in December, it was around Christmas time, and in the play, there was a character in the play who was trying to steal Christmas, similar to the Grinch, but there was no references to the Grinch, but trying to steal Christmas, and so specifically trying to steal the Christmas of a young boy and his dad. And very unfortunately, the person who was the thief, was the robber, was portrayed by a black male, the only black male in the cast. And in the course of the play, when he's confronted, when he's caught and he's confronted and asked why he did it, he said something along the lines of, I wanted children to be mad and upset, because if the children are not mad and upset, then the social workers and the lawyers will not have jobs, or something to that effect. I'm messing it up, but the intent was, we need naughty kids of color so that white people can have social work jobs. That was the message that was sent loud and clear. And as principal, who apparently didn't do a good job vetting what he was taking his kids to, I felt an obligation to say something. Say that again?
It sounds like the cross stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So, just, again, get back to the example here. So I'm like, okay, I have to say something. So that was on a Tuesday. So Wednesday, I typed this email and I sent it off to Viterbo, just explaining. There were some other things that were said too, but that was probably the most egregious one in the play. And they said, thank you so much. We're going to forward this on to, it's actually the Virginia Repertoire Theater, or I was somewhere in Virginia that had come in and done this. And so that was Wednesday. They forwarded it to them. On Thursday, they wrote back to me from Virginia and they said, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We have pulled this play from our repertoire. We are no longer putting this play on.
That's great. Thank you.
Say what? Another example, I'm really proud of a lot of my staff here. I had a teacher send me a text one day. She said, hey, just an FYI, such and such a student came to school today with it was like a Chevy sweatshirt, the car company, and part of in their logo, they had the Confederate flag. And she said, I made him take it off and got another one, and I let mom know what I did and why, but just wanted to give you a heads up in case mom reaches out to you, is upset at all, right? That was something that, just through the culture that we've been trying to build here, that teacher felt comfortable doing that and explaining to the parent right away without even me being involved. Another example, I had another teacher come to me after school one day and said, hey, can I have you look over this email that I wrote? The situation was, earlier that day, a student teacher had, with that teacher, had made the comment of, he was touching black kid's hair and said, oh, I like how your hair feels. The student teacher was. And so the teacher, on their own, wrote an email to the university professor and said, hey, this is what happened and this is not okay. We need to sit down and address this. And they just asked me to look it over. And so I was really proud of my staff in those ways, of that when you see something like this, you're able to say something, and you're able to say it in a way that you can articulate, here's why this is not okay. And we need to fix this. So just a couple of concrete examples.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So, do you still use Little House on the Prairie here? Because I'm a sub-teacher and
Mhm.
it's a lesson plan and I would use that book.
That is a great question. We have been doing a lot of work
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. The question was, do we still use Little House on the Prairie? I don't know off the top of my head if we still use Little House on the Prairie or not. I know that one thing that we've done as we shifted our library, moved it around, and with a lot of other things, is we've been doing a lot more vetting of curriculum and vetting of books. One that comes to my mind is Harry the Dirty Dog. Remember that children's classic, Harry the Dirty Dog? And of course, he's a white dog that he rolls in the mud and gets black and becomes dirty. And then to get clean again, now he becomes white again. And so that was one that we said, we just want to get rid of that one, right? That's one example that sticks into my mind. I know there are others that we have vetted through. I don't know about that one in particular. So Jane Elliott, the blue eyes, brown eyes, she did the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment, right? This quote comes from a very popular, not popular now, she was giving a speech in an auditorium. And she said the following. She said, if you as a white person would be happy to receive the same treatment that our black citizens do in this society, please stand. She gave them a moment and she said, nobody is standing here. And she said, that says very plainly that you know what's happening. You know you don't want it for you. I want to know why you're so willing to accept it or allow it to happen for others. So once again, I am a human being like you all. I am fallible. I make mistakes. I have a little research to do on Little House on the Prairie because I don't have a great answer off the top of my head. So that gives me an action item that I can do on how I can get better. I'm always trying to learn and grow myself, right? Hopefully today, to circle back around to our objectives, hopefully today you have heard something, whether from me or a conversation with somebody else, where you have a little bit more knowledge about being able to describe the socialization of race and how that was influenced over the last few hundred years. But also, hopefully you can see how that has influenced your own identity development, how that socialization has impacted you in the way that you describe yourself and the way that you define yourself and how you attach value. And then hopefully, I know we didn't get too much time on it, but hopefully just a few ideas on how you can interpret how that socialization influences your interactions with other people, and maybe the beginnings of some ideas of how you can do to counteract that effect. And now, that may not be writing an email to get a place shut down. That may be as simple as reminding yourself that, okay, the person that I'm about to interact with probably has a very different life experience than me. I need to keep that in mind. I need to monitor my emotions, right? It may be as simple as that, just monitoring how those subliminal thoughts, messages, feelings, how those are showing up in you right now as you interact with somebody. Maybe it's as simple as that. So that said, thank you for coming today. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your participation. I don't know if there's normally an open Q&A session at the end of these, but yes, there is. Okay.
I didn't hear any applause for Dr.
I know.
Burns. There we go. Thank you all. I do want to recognize that we are at time, so I want to be respectful of that. So if you do need to get somewhere, please feel free to depart and take the time to fill out either a paper evaluation, or we also have an evaluation that you can scan a QR code for. If you do have time to stick around and have some questions for Dr. Burns, we will do an open Q&A session. If you are joining us from Zoom, feel free to put those questions in the chat, and then we will ask them in a large group. So I will go around with the microphone, or actually, if you would repeat the question. Yep,
Okay.
that would be fantastic, okay?
Okay.
All right.
That one over here?
Yes.
So, I actually operate as a community advocate, and one of my focuses is on housing discrimination, particularly by the largest landlord, which is public housing in the city. I've gone to court with people hearings and so forth, and I'm wondering, if you're hearing about that, I would think so, just communities.
Yeah, so the question was, you said that you're an advocate, a housing advocate, or an advocate in housing is one of the,
And I have a law degree too, and tenant landlord is.
yeah, law degree, yes. And so the question is if I have heard much about discrimination in housing in this community?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, so as a community school, one thing that we do on probably about every other year basis is we try to do what's called a community school needs assessment. And that's where we try to survey all of our students, all of our families, all of our staff, and all of the neighborhood, even if they don't have kids in our school. And we ask a list of questions. And one of the things that comes up, and then sometimes we'll do some focus groups to dive deeper to try to understand it. Housing is something that always comes up. And so some of the things that I frequently hear from either our parents or just people in the community here, especially locally in this neighborhood, Polk, Powell, Hamilton, and specifically the Washburn neighborhoods right here, is that there is a lack of quality housing. Even further down, even in other parts of the city, just a common theme there is lack of quality housing, and that the housing is often in a really bad state of disrepair, and that the only things that a lot of our families can afford are places that are not well maintained, not kept up. There's a lot of, another common theme that comes up is issues with landlords. Landlords not following through on what they say they're going to do, landlords treating different renters differently than other renters, largely what I've heard is based specifically on either race or perceived socioeconomic status. Those are kind of the main themes that I have heard in those needs assessments when we've been doing the questions with people in the neighborhood. But I don't have a ton of like specifics, like specifically this person or specifically that person. Yes?
Yeah, so I have a question. I don't know if do you follow the same rules? Does Hamilton and the charter school follow the same rules for the rest of the schools in the district in La Crosse?
Well, so the question was, do the two schools in the building?
That's not really my question.
Oh, sorry,
That
go
was
ahead.
just-
Do we follow the same rules?
I'm just wondering, yeah, if you
I guess it depends on how you define rules. I mean, we have,
so I guess
basically, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so my question is, with professional development, if you have a professional development, let's just say something like this were to be one professional development session, how do you, I guess in your schools, how do you follow through with it on as opposed to having it be a one-shot deal? How do you follow through, and what kind of metrics do you use to assess whether this professional development, for example, would be effective as it manifests in the classroom or in the hallways or in the school culture? How do you assess that, and then what accountability measures are in place for making sure that things happen after you do like a session like this, if you were to do professional development?
Sure. Great question. A lot to unpack there. Let me see if I capture the essence so that everybody else makes sure they're in. So the question is, whether in this school or in the district or both, maybe part of it is like who decides what the professional development is, and if we do professional development like this, how are we measuring its impact? How are we making sure that these types of learning is actually translating into action and things of that nature, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so in the school district here, how it works is that probably about half of our staff development time in the course of a year is directed by the district level, and about half is directed at the building level, so up to the building's discretion. The district has, they have several like very key strategic initiatives that they're focused on. Equity is one of them. Reading achievement is another one, and like inclusion is another one as well right now. And so at the district level, they're constantly planning and providing training for staff around those topics. In terms of actual implementation, it's going to really vary depending upon what the topic is. For example, the reading one, it's very specific with like, for example, right now this year, a lot of our kindergarten through secondary teachers are going to training on a new a new way to teach reading, and they're getting the resources and they're expected to implement it, and that'll come up in the classroom observations. For some of these other topics that are not as prescriptive, it's a lot harder to guarantee that it actually happens, and it's a lot harder to measure the impact, really hard. At the building level, different buildings probably do it differently, and what I have done is, well, so the first staff meeting I ever had, I told the staff that we will be talking about topics of race and poverty and trauma because it is so important, especially when we have a student body that has such a high percentage, and it's something that we'll keep coming back around to. And so I think one of the biggest things is, and so sometimes it's planned just simply by me, other times it's a conversation with staff saying, you know, what are some topics you want to learn more about? And then we'll try to plan some PD around that. It is a process in and of itself, but one of the key features that I like to do is with our school improvement plan every year, and every building has it a little bit differently. There is a template for the district, but within those big goals that we have for the year is where we can spell out like what are the actual things we're going to accomplish and get done. And so if the big goal is, you know, we're going to positively impact student mental health, and then we're going to do all these things. Like we have a way to measure it, but then we also have here the things we're actually going to do, and we have a process in place to say, okay, every quarter when we check in, okay, we said we were going to do this at the beginning of the year, have we done that yet? And so it probably varies a little bit from school to school. One consistent metric is typically every year in the spring we do climate and culture surveys. And so that's where a lot of that soft data that isn't measured like math scores or reading scores, a lot of that soft data about culture and climate comes out in those surveys for both staff and for students. We get a lot of great information here as a community school from those needs assessments when we have a chance to interview and talk to parents as well and community members. I would say it's probably an opportunity for continued growth in terms of saying, how do we take these topics and translate it into real action? Now, the examples I shared, those are fantastic things that happen. Those are fantastic examples, but that wasn't necessarily planned, right? But you can't necessarily plan those types of situations. And so the more that we continue to try to cultivate that culture, ideally, the more people, when they're presented in those situations, they know what's right and they feel confident and supported by leadership into doing what's right. So I don't have like a really perfect answer for you in terms of, oh, this is our system of implementation and this is our system of accountability and it all works perfectly. But hopefully some of that starts to address some of your questions.
Yes, thank you.
What have you found to be your own barrier as principal of a community school that you might be surprised about, that you've recognized, oh, that's a barrier?
So the question was, what is a barrier that I found specifically as a principal of a community school that I was surprised to find? And can I just clarify, a barrier to what?
The creation of this charter school.
Sure. Well, so there are a lot of barriers. Actually, this was the focus of my dissertation was, the focus was looking at the resistance that we find in the field of education to equity-based initiatives, and then specifically how the principals respond to that resistance. So I'm going to give you a little context there, and then I'll circle back around to your question. When I was thinking about what topic to pick, one of the professors kept saying, what is your burning question? What is your burning question? What is the question that keeps you up at night? And for me, the question that keeps me up at night was thinking about the fact that like no teacher gets into education specifically to marginalize children of color. that keeps happening. You know, no parent sends their child to school saying, I can't wait for Mr. Burns' phone call today. It's gonna be 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. today, right? No child comes to school saying, I'm gonna be 3 years behind in grade level at the end of this year, right? But that keeps happening. Specifically more so for some children than others in a very predictable pattern that keeps repeating itself. And so my burning question was like, why? Why is there resistance to doing what we say is all the common goal that we say? And so I really tried to dive into and unpack that. And there are a lot of, I mean, that's a whole another presentation in and of itself to dive into what was found there, but certainly background specifically, well, I'll say this. Before here, I was a principal in Sun Prairie, and at the school there, about 27% of students identified as students of color. And there, we had an equity team. And after the first year, I got rid of the equity team, because when you have an equity team, equity is something that just that team does. We got a team for it, so they can do it. I don't have to worry about it, right? But it was a real challenge to get that staff there to understand why we needed to keep talking about these topics, why we needed to keep looking for other ways to change our practices, our curriculum, our instruction, assessment. It was a real challenge because it was only 26%. But then I come here, and one thing that I thought was going to be a barrier wasn't, because here I did not have to spend any time convincing the staff that this was important work, because they see it, they live it every day. 60% students of color, 83% students from low-income backgrounds. They see it, they live it every day. So that's one thing that I thought was going to be a barrier that actually wasn't, was convincing the staff that this was important work. One thing that was a barrier that I maybe didn't anticipate, well, to some extent it was anticipated, but just the amount of things that are on my plate. Scheduling, just like the day-to-day operations, like I started counting one day how many questions people had, how many things somebody said, I need to talk to you about this, or I need to ask you about that. You got 2 minutes for this? I started counting one day from when I walked in the door, and after about a half an hour, I lost count at 8. You know, I usually get stopped by 3 people just on my way into my office, right? It's just the busyness of the day-to-day of being in charge of 350 human beings, 300 students, 50 staff. Everybody has a role, but everybody needs to have a schedule for what their day looks like, and everybody needs to know what they're doing each time of day. Like, it's sometimes overwhelming just to get us through a day of functioning and not losing a kid, right? And so that is something that was a little anticipated, but it's something that is just constantly there. It's constantly there, and it can get in the way of that big picture stuff. In terms of other barriers, you know, I would say, here's another barrier that I'm currently working on, and maybe that'll help answer your question. Another barrier that I'm currently working on is, so as the school that has the high percentage of students of color and high percentage of students of poverty, and we're the community school, we're trying to do all these things, and we're trying to engage our partners, whether that's Gunderson or Viterbo or the City of La Crosse Housing Authority. We're trying to engage our partners to identify these systemic needs and think outside the box. And one thing that is consistently a challenge is we have very well-intentioned people in the community and a lot of great supports, but the way it's set up, there are barriers to the people who really need the supports accessing them. And there are also barriers to, it's kind of like what goes back to that play in the sense that a lot of the supports are set up to meet individual needs reactively. And a lot of these systems and a lot of these partners are not necessarily interested in reimagining themselves out of a job, if you will, right? And one thing I constantly say is that when we are having these conversations with our partners, we have to make sure that they understand that our community school strategy is not something that the school is doing in isolation, that they occasionally throw money at, but rather it is a strategy, a way of approaching transforming a whole community that we all need to own jointly. And so I would say that has been a barrier that I maybe didn't anticipate, because to me, it just seems to click. Like, to me, I know I don't know all the right answers. I know that I'm still learning, but to me, like going down this path, it just makes sense, especially in that way of needing to evolve to address those roots and not just the leaves. And I feel like there's a lot of places where we're just stuck on the leaves, if that makes sense.
Thank you for this presentation.
You're welcome. I think you had your hand up before?
I forgot what I was gonna ask.
Very good at sorry. That's because I talk too much. Yes.
Last question. Oh, just your comment about the Sun Prairie School and only 26%. I mean, it seems like it's overwhelming here, but maybe that's where it needs to happen more. That kids need to be educated, staff needs to be aware, I don't know, if students aware of the racial issues, and that it just becomes so overwhelming in this community because it's very difficult to solve everything because there's, you know, so many problems and so many issues. And that,
No, sorry.
that's okay.
So just to capture for the audience, a comment in that, in comparing, just to make sure I have it correct, in comparing Sun Prairie to La Crosse, I feel like that the place with the lower percentages, like more work needs to happen there, like it's more important there than here, and that when there's so many problems in one place, it can be overwhelming. I would say that this is important work that needs to be happening everywhere, and I'm sure you would probably agree. And I think how you go about approaching, like starting that work, it may vary a little bit depending upon your specific context, but hopefully we're always ending up at the same point. And when you have a higher concentration of needs, specifically a higher concentration of childhood trauma, traumatic experience events, it absolutely, it makes things different, right? You know, the way that our children are showing up here is very different than at Southern Bluffs or at Northwoods or at State Road. And it is what it is. I mean, I'm just going to name it. And that doesn't mean that those schools are bad schools, not by any stretch of the imagination. But it does mean that we need to be responsive to the conditions while still having the same expectations for all where we want to end up for everybody, right? One of the things that, and maybe this is a good note to end on, one of the things that always comes up in terms of race work or equity work along any other aspect of identity development is that it's seen as a zero-sum game, and that in order for others to gain, I have to lose, right? But that, again, is just one more lie that we were told, right? My life is so much richer and so much more fulfilling because of going down this road I've gone down. And I haven't lost anything. I haven't lost or had to give up anything. And so that's just another thing that I think sometimes we're told out there, and it's just not true. So that's it. Okay. Thank you again. Thank you again for coming.